If you want to support the channel, then please check out my Patreon page to gain access to exclusive videos, take part in Q&As, and watch my retrospectives before they go live on YouTube.
I want him dead too, Flint. That's why I've been looking for you.
I want to kill the spider. You want to kill the spider. Together, he doesn't stand a chance.
Interested?
Wow.
Tell me you love me.
I love you. I love you so much. I always have.
Originally, we thought that this man, Dennis Carradine, was your husband's killer. We were wrong. The actual killer is still at large.
What are you talking about?
This is the man who killed your husband. His name is Flint Marco. He's a small-time crook who's been in and out of prison.
Well, why weren't we told about this? This man killed my uncle, and he's still out there!
Flint Marco, the guy we tied to the Ben Parker homicide.
What about him?
He just broke out of Rikers.
And?
He's on the run. He's in the marshlands. I think we got him.
Remember me?
Yes, Father.
I was right about her. About Peter. About everything. You know what you must do. Make him suffer. Make him wish he were dead. First, we attack his heart.
Harry. You knew this was coming, Pete.
Never seen anything like it. Let me look at it in the morning and run some tests. Can we do that now? It seems to like you. Don't let any of that get on you. Why not? It has the characteristics of a symbiote, which needs to bond to a host to survive. And sometimes these things in nature, when they bind, they can be hard to unbind.
What do you want from me?
Remember Ben Parker?
What does it matter to you anyway?
Everything!
Everybody needs help sometimes, Peter. Even Spiderman.
Spider-Man swung back onto the big screen for his third entry in the hugely popular series in late April 2007 for its premiere, and the film got its general release in early May. Again directed by Sam Raimi at a cost of over $250 million. Some reports said it was closer to $300 million, making it the most expensive film ever made at the time. As Spider-Man 2 was such a huge hit with critics and fans of the iconic Marvel character, the hype was out of control for Spider-Man 3, and Sony went into overdrive to promote it, and it eventually grossed nearly $900 million worldwide, making it the most successful film that year, and it would prove a big hit on DVD and Blu-ray. The previous two entries had received strong reviews, but Spider-Man 3 didn't get the same love, with most reviews being very mixed, with some praising its production values and action sequences, and with others calling out its messy script and its inclusion of too many characters. The New York Times said the film mostly just plods, and said it lacked humour. Richard Roper of the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film only 2 stars out of 4, feeling for every slam-bang action sequence, there are far too many sluggish scenes. Roger Ebert also gave it the same rating, saying the film was a mess with too many villains, subplots, romantic misunderstandings, and conversations. On a positive note, Jonathan Ross, a big fan of Spider-Man, felt the film was the best of the trilogy, and magazine Total Film felt Spider-Man 3's complex plot helped the film's pacing in that it rarely feels disjointed or loose. Of course, with any Spider-Man movie comes with a wealth of merchandise to appeal to children. Hasbro released several toys to tie in with the film. This included a deluxe web-spinning blaster, along with several lines of action figures aimed at both children and adult collectors who had cash to blow on large-scale and more detailed figures. A video game was also released that will be discussed later in the video. To celebrate its 10th anniversary in 2017, Sony put out a new cut called the Editor's Cut, which removed 2 minutes from its runtime. Alternative scenes were included, some original scenes were extended or removed entirely, such as Harry's servant revealing the truth on how his father died. Instead, this new cut has Harry just look at a photo of him with Peter and MJ to change his mind. More of Christopher Young's score was also restored. Despite the negative reviews, the strong box office encouraged plans to continue with a 4th entry in the franchise. There were talks at the time that Sam would be taking on the directing duties of The Hobbit and leaving Spider-Man behind him, but obviously he never committed to that series. Raimi had wanted to pursue with the Vulture for Spider-Man 4. Felicity Harding, Vulture's daughter, would appear as the Black Cat, and in one version of the many scripts that would be produced, she would have an affair with Peter in order to shatter his engagement with Mary Jane. Dr. Connors would also finally transform into the Lizard, and there were also rumours of Bruce Campbell getting a larger role in the franchise, appearing as Mysterio. Sam Raimi went through many drafts and revisions and was never happy with any of them. At one time, the idea of shooting 2 sequels concurrently was under consideration. However, Sony Pictures announced in 2010 that plans for Spider-Man 4 had been cancelled due to Raimi's withdrawal from the project, as he couldn't commit to a script and the release date. Sony decided to reboot the series in 2012 with Andrew Garfield in the lead. That series came to an end in 2014 due to the poor reviews for its sequel, so Spider-Man was recast yet again with Tom Holland in the lead in 2017 with Spider-Man Homecoming. Years later, Sam Raimi reflected on Spider-Man 3, saying, "It's a movie that just didn't work very well. I tried to make it work, but I didn't really believe in all the characters, so that couldn't be hidden from people who loved Spider-Man. I should have just stuck with the characters and the relationships and progressed them to the next step, and not tried to top the bar." Development for Spider-Man 3 began soon after Spider-Man 2's release, and Sony set a release date for summer 2007, so they had about 3 years to plan and finish the film. Sam Raimi's brother Ivan wrote a treatment with Sam over the course of 2 months. Sam wanted to focus on the Sandman and the Vulture as the main villains of the film. He was in talks with Ben Kingsley to play the part of the Vulture, but talks ended when the producer Avi Arad convinced Raimi to include Venom instead. In the early writing process, Eddie Brock did make an appearance as to set the groundwork for his potential transformation into Venom in future. Avi felt the series had relied too much on Sam's personal favourite Spider-Man villains, and not characters that modern fans were actually interested in. So Sam Raimi included Venom to please Avi Arad and the studio. Sam wasn't really a fan of the character, but began to appreciate the famous villain more as he went through the writing process, and he felt he would return to his original idea of including the Vulture for a potential 4th entry in the series. Eddie Brock would serve as a mirror to Peter Parker, with both characters having similar jobs and romantic interests. Brock's actions as a journalist would reflect contemporary themes of paparazzi and tabloid journalism. Sam always found Sandman a visually fascinating character and wanted to expand upon his background and not just have him be a petty villain as he was portrayed in the early comics, so they decided he would be Uncle Ben's killer to increase Peter's guilt over his death and challenge his simplistic perception of the event. Sam also needed to conclude Harry Osborn's storyline. Harry would not follow his father's legacy, but be instead somewhere in between. With the symbiote being included, they wanted to explore Peter's darker side, which Tobey and Maguire found exciting. This would send Peter on a different path, affecting his relationship with MJ and introducing a new love interest with Gwen Stacy. Overall, Raimi described the film as being about Peter, Mary Jane, Harry and the Sandman, with Peter's journey being one of forgiveness. With so many additions, Alvin Sargent, who was hired again to rewrite and polish Ivan and Sam's work, soon found the script so complex and overstuffed that he considered splitting it into 2 films, but abandoned the idea when he could not create a successful intermediate climax. Outside of the returning cast members, we have Thomas Hayden Church playing as Flint Marko, aka Sandman. Thomas was approached to play the part because of his award-winning performance in the film Sideways, and accepted the role despite not reading the script. Thomas worked out for 16 weeks to gain 28 pounds of muscle. Flint is a small-time thug and has escaped from prison to return to his wife and sick daughter, for whom he aims to steal money to help get the treatment to cure her. He transforms into Sandman following a freak accident and incurs Peter's wrath when Peter learns he was Uncle Ben's true killer. Topher Grace, the star of that 70s show, stars as Eddie Brock, who later transforms into Venom. Eddie is a freelance photographer in desperate need of a full-time job and is competing with Peter at the Daily Bugle. At first, Topher was puzzled he was approached to play the part, since in the comics Brock is a middle-aged, muscle-bound guy. Topher's first reaction was that it was a bad idea, saying people are religious about not straying too far from the page. but Topher Grace figured Raimi knew what he was doing when he explained that Brock in the film would be a kind of dark doppelganger to Parker. Once in the costume for the third act, he found it quite unpleasant, as he had to be constantly smeared to give a liquid-like feel to his outfit. The outfit took an hour to put on, though prosthetics took 4 hours to apply. Topher Grace also wore fangs which bruised his gums. Bryce Dallas Howard plays as Gwen Stacy, who was Peter's first love in the comics. Bryce strived to create a sense that Gwen could potentially be a future girlfriend for Peter, and not someone who was there to steal Peter away from MJ. Howard performed many of her own stunts, having to wear a tight harness around her waist and stomach. She was unaware of the fact she was several months pregnant. James Cromwell plays as Captain George Stacy, Gwen's father. James has been a star of TV since the 70s, and has appeared in many big movies such as Babe, Eraser, Deep Impact, Star Trek First Contact, and Jurassic World Fallen Kingdom alongside Bryce Dallas Howard. We have minor roles for Lucy Gordon as news reporter Jennifer Dugan. Lucy sadly committed suicide in 2009 at the age of 28. Newscaster Hal Fishman appears as himself, anchoring the kidnapping of Mary Jane by Venom. He unfortunately died just 14 weeks after the movie opened at the age of 75. And finally we have cameos from Bruce Campbell, playing as a maitre d', the late Stan Lee, and Cliff Robertson returning as Ben Parker, for what would be his final role on film as he passed away in 2011. Shooting was scheduled to start in early January of 2006, but to plan ahead for the extensive visual effects sequences, the camera crew went to New York in November 2005 and spent 2 weeks photographing all the buildings for the FX crew to reference and replicate in the computer. Principal photography began in January and wrapped in July 2006 after over 100 days of filming. They made use of Sony Pictures in California, where they would shoot interior sequences and specific action scenes, for example the crane sequence featuring Gwen Stacy. The production moved to Cleveland due to the Greater Cleveland Film Commission offering production space at the city's convention centre at no cost. The city would double for New York for Spider-Man's first battle with Sandman. The demanding shoot in Cleveland meant that a section in downtown was shut to the public. The pavements had to be repainted to resemble those in New York, and traffic signs and electricity poles were removed for stunts. They doubled the amount of days shooting in New York compared to Spider-Man 2, starting in late May and finishing at the start of July. They took advantage of various locations: Times Square, Central Park, City Hall, Manhattan Plaza, and areas in Brooklyn. Shooting started taking a toll on Sam Raimi, who was juggling several units at once to get the location footage in the can. Cinematographer Bill Pope was having a difficult time as well, as his symbiote Spider-Man, Venom and the new Goblin were costumed in black during fight scenes, taking place at night. Test audiences got to preview an early rough cut of the film, and the results were mixed. Many felt it needed more action and a better resolve to Sandman's journey, so Sam Raimi had to go back and do some reshoots just prior to the release. Sam was working on the film right down to the last minute, with Sony constantly over his shoulder pressuring him to finish on time. The film opens with Spider-Man being celebrated by the city of New York. Peter is in high spirits and is finally happy in his life and plans to propose to MJ, who has just made her debut on Broadway. Peter and MJ are relaxing in Central Park and unaware of a meteorite that lands nearby. Out of the meteorite, a black goo emerges and attaches itself to Peter's motorbike as he and MJ leave. Harry Osborn has taken a performance-enhancing gas and is out to seek revenge against Peter for his father's death, using his Green Goblin technology. With a surprise attack, he and Peter battle it out over the streets. During the chaos, Peter takes out Harry, causing him to suffer a head injury, resulting in him having amnesia, losing his memory of Peter as Spider-Man. Across town, Flip Marko has escaped from prison. It's revealed that he was behind Uncle Ben's death, and the police are on his tail. He falls into an experimental particle accelerator that fuses his body with the surrounding sand. He transforms into Sandman. He can now control sand and reform his body with it. To celebrate Spider-Man, the city has a festival to honour him after he saved Gwen Stacy's life. Peter gets carried away and lets Gwen kiss him, in a similar fashion to how he was kissed by MJ. MJ, seeing this, is furious. Suddenly Sandman appears and attacks an armoured truck. Spider-Man jumps into action and attempts to stop him, but unaware of his abilities he loses the fight and Sandman escapes. Peter learns of Flint's history and his involvement in the death of his uncle. Peter is desperate to find him and his anger begins to get the better of him. The alien symbiote is attracted to his powers and rage and assimilates the suit. Peter awakens on top of a building and discovers his strength has increased. Peter locates Sandman and battles him in a subway tunnel. Discovering that water is Flint's weakness, he opens a pipe releasing water that reduces Sandman to mud and washes him away. Spider-Man thinks he has killed him. Peter's anger begins to take over as he loses his temper quickly. He appears to subtly change as his hair turns darker. The symbiote is slowly bonding with Peter, and he is finding it increasingly difficult to detach himself from it, as his addiction to it is like a drug. At the Daily Bugle, Peter exposes rival photographer Eddie Brock, whose fake photos depict Spider-Man as a criminal. Publisher J. Jonah Jameson fires Brock and hires Peter to be a staff photographer. Eddie is now unemployed and wants to get his revenge. At the same time, MJ and Peter's relationship is starting to fall apart, and Harry's memory has returned. The visual effects for Spider-Man 3 would be supervised by Scott Stopdike. John Dykstra, who won an Academy Award for his work on Spider-Man 2, declined to work on a third film, instead choosing to work on Hancock. Stopdike's team of 270 people worked for more than 2 years to create 950 shots, and they were one of many studios that worked on the film. That list includes Evil Eye Pictures, Furious FX, Gentle Giant Studios and Giant Killer Robots, to name just a few, to help with the huge workload. The visual effects budget alone was approximately 30% more than the previous film. Sony Imageworks had a huge challenge on their hands. They had 2 new villains that had to be created in the computer, both radically different in their execution and visual style, also provide photorealistic models of the actors for a number of the complex action sequences. The film would incorporate every technique in the book to achieve the shots. They had in-camera wire work and stunts, miniatures, blue screen and computer-generated material. For the first big action sequence, they had Peter being attacked without his mask. Imageworks needed to create a photorealistic digital stunt double for Tobey. The studio had used the Light Stage System motion capture software previously for Spider-Man 2 and Superman Returns, both having mixed results, especially on Superman. The crew devised a new system for Spider-Man 3. The studio captured the actors' faces in various lighting environments and applied that texture to 3D models animated with facial expressions, with the help of a new motion control rig. The look of the Sandman went through many designs, and experiments were done with 12 types of sand, such as splashing, launching it at stuntmen and pouring it over ledges. Animating Sandman involved creating a performance for a shell shaped like the character that contained sand, and moving individual grains of sand inside the shell and falling from the character's body. To move individual grains of sand, Imageworks took several approaches. They used particle simulation, a new simulation engine called Sphere Sim, and RenderMan plugins, sometimes in combination. Thomas Hayden Church was often superimposed onto the screen, where CGI was then applied. The first shot of the Sandman forming took roughly 6 months to create. When animating the symbiote, Sam Raimi did not want it to resemble a spider or an octopus, and to give it a sense of character. The CG model is made of many separate strands. Animators saw tubular shapes on screen that represented each curve's final look. Using simple rigs, they could place a curve after curve to crawl the goo along an arm, or build claw-shaped rigs that reached out for a host, like a hand. To give the animated goo a secondary motion, the effects team used cloth and hair simulation on the curves to help the goo ooze and jiggle as it transforms and reshapes. When animating Venom himself, animators observed footage of big cats such as lions and cheetahs for the character's agile movements. In the comics and 90s cartoons, Spider-Man's black suit had a white spider design on the front and back. In the film, it just becomes a black version of his traditional suit, which makes perfect sense, but I do wish they had something more familiar to his comic book version. I do think the visual effects have stood up well over time, despite the intense workload the FX crew had. I think the beauty of combining many separate elements of live action material with miniatures and CGI, those scenes are the most impressive, especially with saving Gwen and the final battle. The symbiote effect seamlessly blends with the footage, and the birth of the Sandman is still pretty incredible. The action scenes that incorporate blue/green screen work are lit well enough for the elements to fit together and not look too fake. It's tough for the FX crew to hide some of the visual traits of CGI that give the illusion away, especially during a daytime sequence where this happens a number of times in the film. With the fast camera moves and edits, you can keep the audience focused on the action and not have them looking for the flaws. The weakest element is unfortunately the CG doubles for Peter, Harry and MJ. The Uncanny Valley thought comes to mind. They look like porcelain dolls in some shots. It's an effect that artists still can't get right even today. The human eye can instantly spot if something doesn't look quite right. Aside from those issues, I think they deliver on the spectacle and keep the standards high throughout. For Spider-Man 3, composer Christopher Young takes over, replacing Danny Elfman, who had no desire to compose the sequel due to having a bad experience working with Sam Raimi on Spider-Man 2. You can find out more about that in my Spider-Man 2 retrospective. Chris wasn't given the job straight away, he got the call about 3 months into production. Apparently Sam Raimi had auditioned 6 different composers for the job, but admitting he really wanted Chris Young. Christopher had to familiarise himself with the scores from both the first and second film. It wasn't until he sat down to spot Spider-Man 3 that he decided which of Danny's themes he was going to use and when and where they should be implemented. He did his absolute best to honour the material and figure out a way to come up with his own music, but at the same time acknowledge what Danny had done in the previous 2 films. Sam Raimi encouraged Chris to come up with instantly identifiable melodies or motifs for the new set of villains. Chris wanted to write catchy themes that had a distinctive personality. They had to be aggressive. He wanted the black suit Spider-Man to have a scary theme, and the opposite for the Sandman theme, which is low, aggressive and heavy. Venom was supposed to be vicious. Chris was told that he was the devil personified. His theme ends up being much more demonic sounding. The score sadly has never been officially released. Chris Young was interviewed and asked why. He highlighted that Danny Elfman has to greenlight it as it uses his themes. Danny requested at the time that any reference to his thematic themes, such as ones composed for Spider-Man and Green Goblin, had to be removed from the cues for the CD release, and since it was an understanding from the beginning that Chris was going to adapt Danny's music, by removing those themes made the CD release pointless. At the time, Sony put out an album featuring a selection of songs from the film, such as Snow Patrol, The Killers and Black Mountain. No tracks featured Chris's work. This album didn't sell particularly well and probably put off Sony from pursuing a score release. The Spider-Man 3 score out of the Raimi trilogy is my favourite. The new themes for Sandman and the Black Spider-Man are really impressive. Sandman's first appearance has this very heartfelt melody that evolves into this low menacing march. The dark theme for Spider-Man has elements of Chris's work from the Hellraiser films. Chris throws in jazz for Peter's fight with Harry, which works extremely well. Jazz should always be part of Spider-Man's score, as New York is such an important scene for jazz music. I think with Chris and Sam's horror background, they really get a chance to flex their skills in this area due to its darker themes and ideas. Some of Chris's best work is in the editor's cut, where we see an extended scene of Peter sitting on his bed and he is tempted to put on the black suit. As he opens the case, he sees the suit is alive. A very cool scene and scored brilliantly. As the film does have a downbeat ending in the recent editor's cut, Chris had composed an alternative cue that is far more uplifting. It's a huge shame his score isn't readily available. There are bootlegs out there and you can sample tracks on YouTube. It's certainly worth a listen. The video game based on the movie arrived on all the gaming platforms, turning up on the Game Boy Advance, PC, Nintendo DS, PS2, Nintendo Wii, PSP, Xbox 360 and the PlayStation 3. Like many video games based on movies, they expand on the film's plot to throw in additional characters such as Kingpin and Kraven, drawing upon elements from the comics. The game ends up being loosely based on the film. The majority of the cast, excluding Kirsten Dunst, provide their voices for the cutscenes. A few supporting characters from the film, such as Gwen, Aunt May and Captain George Stacy, are removed from the storyline. Bruce Campbell once again returns to be your tour guide throughout the game and provides some great humour. Whereas the video game for Spider-Man 2 was praised by the fans and critics, the third video game less so, maybe due to the rushed nature of it. It was pointed out for being Spider-Man 2 with a new lick of paint, and it wasn't well implemented on the PS3 and 360. At the time those versions were praised for their graphics, but had performance issues with the frame rate dropping a lot throughout, the camera getting lost and graphical glitches here and there. The boss battles became very repetitive, the side missions were dull and got boring very quickly. Some publications gave it 3 out of 10 and others were more favourable. Since its release it hasn't aged well and is best avoided. The PlayStation 2, Wii and PSP versions had the stories changed in areas, with some villains being swapped out for other ones. It features adjustments to its story and was shortened in areas. It was criticised for having poor controls and disappointing graphics, but the game's performance handled better, with less of the frame rate dropping issues compared to the more modern console versions. The Nintendo DS game is a standard side-scroller with a touchscreen option thrown in. Not particularly exciting, and the GBA game had weaker graphics than the previous Spidey games on the handheld. So overall the games exhibit problems and just don't really deliver something that is memorable. If you want your fix of web-slinging action, play Spider-Man on the PS4, which is a fantastic game and is the best Spider-Man game to date, though it is missing Bruce Campbell. I, like everyone else, was desperate to see Spider-Man 3 back in the summer of 2007. The quality and strength of Spidey 2 just left us wanting more. The third film arrived when I was still working as a projectionist, and I got to preview it shortly before its general release. There was a collective groan from the other staff members after it finished. I was also a bit underwhelmed by its overall quality. I think the first thing that came to one's mind was that it had too many characters and storylines that all don't get enough screen time to be fully fleshed out and satisfying. You certainly get a sense that Venom and Eddie Brock had been crowbarred into the story. It feels that it really wants to focus on Sandman and Peter and MJ's relationship. As we know, Raimi was forced to include Venom to please the producers. What we get is an overstuffed script. Even by 2007, you'd think filmmakers and producers would have learnt their lessons of the past with including too many characters, i.e. villains, into a film. It never does it justice. We saw this happen with the Batman films of the 90s as the villains took over and Batman found himself just in the background of his own movie. Even though the film is stuffed with storylines, it also wastes time on scenes that could have been cut out to add more character development. Harry and MJ just dancing around in the kitchen, it just made me roll my eyes, and it's cringy to watch. Peter strutting around New York trying to show off as he descends into his darker side. As I mentioned in my older review of Spider-Man 2, the Spider-Man films have similar traits to the Christopher Reeve Superman films. The third movie has Superman turn evil, and the same for Spider-Man 3. Peter's montage has elements that did make me laugh, in particular him talking back to JJ and sitting in his chair, but they go too far with it. It just ends up not being funny, and it brought on a wealth of internet memes. Speaking of the humour, the previous two films were full of great gags and comedic moments. This one fails to hit the mark. The gag involving Jameson having to be reminded to take his pills just falls flat. The scene with Bruce Campbell is pure gold though, and the best of his appearances in the trilogy. Sandman was supposed to be the main focus of the film. He clearly gets shunted to the side halfway into this film. He is supposed to be trying to save his daughter, but little screen time is dedicated to that, and we never get a chance for him to be alone to collect his thoughts or share them with someone to really explore his character, for there to be a solid arc for him. It's only at the end we get this emotional scene with him and Peter as he apologises to him for the death of his uncle. It's a good scene but felt like a quick way to wrap things up due to the failings in the script. His transformation into Sandman is a fantastic sequence, but how this comes about is so poorly executed. He just randomly falls into this experiment that's taking place. This is the sort of writing you'd see in a cheap TV series, not in a feature film. Spider-Man 2 set up that JJ's son John was going into space. He now has beef with MJ for leaving him for Peter, so their conflict could be explored. So I was expecting Jameson's son to bring the symbiote back with him for Spider-Man 3, and he would turn into Venom. It would follow the comics and cartoon in that respect. So if you were a fan of Venom, I expect you may have felt shortchanged with their slapdash approach of introducing the alien and Eddie Brock's eventual transformation into the villain, which happens all too quickly at the end, as it tries to rush to get Spider-Man to face off against him and Sandman. I read the Venom storyline as a kid and enjoyed the 90s cartoon, which nicely covered Peter's experience with the symbiote and Brooks' encounter with it, so it feels like a missed opportunity in this film to really explore more of Eddie Brock and his experience with the symbiote to create confusion in New York City. For example, people would think it was Spider-Man attacking the innocent and committing crimes. Harry losing his memory was so contrived and a clumsy excuse to get one of the villains out of the picture so they can deploy him later on. When he is trying to come to terms with his amnesia, he tries to connect with MJ. He reveals he wants her to play for her, which took the levels of cheese up to 11. Some of these conversations are just embarrassing and lack the quality of writing we received in Spider-Man 2. There's nothing wrong with Franco's performance. He does a really good job of playing a villain once he attempts to ruin Peter's relationship with MJ, but everything leading up to this exhibits clunky writing. Gwen Stacy has no business being in this movie. Bryce does a good job with it, but again there's not enough time given to the script to do anything with her. Her father should have been introduced in the last movie, with a minor role perhaps to hint that Gwen may appear later on. Gwen is used to cause friction between MJ and Peter. Gwen clearly likes Peter and is naive to her advances and affection, but with how things play out with Harry coming between MJ and Peter, Gwen's role within this story just ends up being pointless. MJ quickly becomes frustrated with Peter and their relationship. Peter unintentionally is insensitive, and for once in his life he is happy and fails to realise MJ's having her own problems. MJ spends a majority of the movie being upset. She loses her job due to complaints about her quality of singing. In reality, if her voice wasn't powerful enough, she wouldn't have got the job in the first place. That's why they have auditions. She then thinks Peter is cheating on her and is forced to dump Peter at the wishes of Harry, so there isn't anything for her to look forward to, and Kirsten looks kind of bored throughout, and yet again thrown into being the damsel in distress for the third act. So things I do love about the film: of course the score by Christopher Young, It's the best looking film out of the series. Bill Pope really amps up the colours and contrast, giving it a more comic book flavour, with inky blacks that come with a darker tone and introduction of Venom. I do love that Sam Raimi gets to flex his horror skills as a director, pushing the symbiote imagery, and when Venom appears in his full form, he gets to be really scary, and Sam uses his horror tools to make those moments work. The action scenes are really well executed. Sam Raimi is a pro when it comes to that. He knows how to deliver thrilling action sequences. The final battle, which does have some great moments as Spider-Man really struggles to fend off Venom and Sandman. That scene when he's on his last legs trying to reach out to MJ is a powerful emotional moment, and then Harry comes in to save the day for a nice team-up battle. The finale, however, does arrive pretty quickly, with a news report thrown in to speed it up, oddly feeling out of place, as a breaking news report of this nature hasn't been deployed before, and its execution makes it unintentionally comical. I think the film's strength is really getting across Peter's guilt for what he has done. You get a strong sense he can't correct it quickly by just saving the day. The emotional core of this movie is strong, and Tobey goes through a lot of emotions, making it very believable. It's a shame Sam Raimi had difficulties with the studio, which hampered the overall quality of the film. You think by the third entry they could trust Sam to make the right decisions creatively to make a successful film, but I think Sony relied so much on this series for their profits, it becomes an issue of risk, and they want to please everyone to make sure the film will be the biggest hit. With so many voices in the production and at Sony wanting their ideas implemented, we have been delivered a compromised film. We've seen it happen so many times before with sequels over the years, especially with superhero films. They never seem to learn and just have their eyes fixated on the huge profits they think they can make. If Sam Raimi just got to make the film he wanted, I think we could have been given a solid trilogy that could be up there with Star Wars and Lord of the Rings, etc. Heck, we could have seen more adventures of Spider-Man with Raimi behind the lens, but that wasn't to be, and Sony in their lack of patience delivered us a batch of reboots. Spider-Man 3 is still enjoyable to watch despite its overly depressing tone and direction. It's not really a feel-good movie. I have warmed to it over the years. The hype was so strong before it came out, I suppose it was difficult for them to meet those expectations. I would give the editor's cut a go though. Not a huge amount of changes, but you may get a little more enjoyment out of it. I just wish they had held back and kept things simple. 2 villains max per movie. Any more than that, it becomes problematic. If they had followed the structure and direction of Spider-Man 2, it could have been a perfect third entry in the series.
Flint Marko, the man who killed Uncle Ben. He was killed last night.
What happened?
Spider-Man killed him.
Good riddance.
Spider-Man doesn't kill people.
He deserved it, didn't he?
I don't think it's for us to say whether a person deserves to live or die.
But Aunt May, he killed Uncle Ben.
But he wouldn't want us living 1 second with revenge in our hearts.
I come before you today to ask you for one thing. I want you to kill Peter Parker.
It's like a poison. It can take you over. Before you know it, turn us into something ugly.
Peter, stop! Who are you?
I don't know.
You're gonna kill me like you killed my father.
I'm done trying to convince you.
You took him from me. He loved me.
You were an embarrassment to him.
You're a good person, and I know you will find a way to put it right.
I need your help. Can't take them both. Not by myself. You don't deserve my help.
We can find a way to settle this.
You're so right. I'm thinking humiliation. Kind of like how you humiliated me. You made me lose my girl. Now I'm gonna make you lose yours.
This could be a tragic day for the people of New York. It could be the end of Spider-Man.